We're keeping it small. He said it the way people say things they've already decided, with the same flat, practical tone he used when he mentioned parking logistics or traffic updates. He paused, not to ask for my opinion, but as if waiting for the conversation to move on by itself. In that pause, the boundary became visible. I held the phone a little lower, away from my ear, not because the signal was bad, but because there wasn't anything to add that wouldn't make the moment heavier than it needed to be. There were details I could have asked about, specific dates, guest numbers, where people would stand, but the sentence had already done its work without them. Asking would have been an intrusion into a structure that was already complete. After we hung up, I stayed where I was and finished what I'd been doing. I didn't circle back. I didn't send a follow-up message later that day. By evening, the phrase had settled into the background, like a new piece of furniture you notice only when you reach for something that used to be there. When my son first mentioned the wedding, it did not arrive as an announcement. It was not a moment carved out of the day, set aside for the sharing of good news. It came folded into another conversation entirely, attached to a scheduling question he was trying to solve while doing something else. He needed to know whether a certain weekend in October worked for me. He asked this not because of the ceremony itself, but because there was a chance they would be traveling the week before. And he wanted to know if I would be around to watch the dog if the timing overlapped. The wedding was mentioned only as the reason for the travel, a piece of data required to make the logistics of the dog sitting work. I answered the question he asked. I checked my calendar, confirmed I was free, and told him I could do it. I did not ask the questions that naturally crowded behind my teeth. I did not ask about the engagement, which had technically happened months ago without a formal declaration. I did not ask about the date of the ceremony itself. I simply confirmed the weekend. The rest stayed unspoken. At the time, that felt appropriate. It felt like I was respecting the pace he was setting. After that, information arrived in pieces. It did not come in a linear stream. There was no phone call where we sat down, metaphorically or otherwise, to walk through the timeline. Instead, details were dropped into the middle of other exchanges. A venue somewhere outside the city was mentioned because he complained about the deposit. A date was shifted by a week because of a conflict with his work schedule. Each update came with a quick, reflexive apology, a note about how fast everything was moving, as if the speed of life was a weather system that happened to him, rather than a pace he was choosing. I said it was fine. Most days, it was. I took out my planner and wrote the date down. I used a pencil. I did not write it in the center of the page, where I usually blocked out important events in ink. I wrote it along the side, in the narrow column reserved for notes or tentative reminders. The handwriting was small, light enough to be erased without leaving a ghost on the paper. A moment later, I closed the planner and slid it back onto the shelf without marking anything else around it. I did not circle it. I did not write, "wedding," in capital letters. I simply noted the coordinates of time and closed the book. There were moments, early on, when I considered asking what kind of gathering it would be. Large or small, family heavy or simple. I would formulate the questions while washing dishes or driving to the store. I would practice the tone, ensuring it sounded casual, merely curious, stripping away any hint of expectation or pressure. But those moments never found a clean opening. Our conversations were brief. He called between meetings, or while driving from one site to another. There was always the background noise of a blinker clicking or the rush of wind against the receiver. There was always the sense that he was fitting me into the edges of his day, slotting the call into the dead time of a commute. He was not avoiding me. It didn't feel evasive. It felt like management. He was managing time carefully, and I was a variable that had been allotted a specific duration. I learned, through trial and error, which questions slowed things down. Questions about logistics, parking, hotels, flight times were answered quickly. They were problems to be solved. Questions about the texture of the day, who was standing where, what the colors were, how they were feeling about it all, were met with a different kind of pause. A slight hesitation, a sigh that wasn't quite impatience but was certainly fatigue. I learned that those questions required him to switch modes, to move from logistics manager to son, and he did not have the energy for the switch. so I stopped asking them. Once, he mentioned they were finalizing the guest list. He said it quickly, almost as if reading it from a document on a screen while we spoke. Then immediately moved on to talk about the caterer and a dispute over menu pricing. I listened. I held the phone tight against my ear. I didn't interrupt to ask who was on the list. I didn't ask if there were people I needed to contact. There was no pause in his monologue that suggested my input was needed. And over time, I had learned to wait for signals rather than create them. Creating a signal, clearing my throat, interjecting, asking to back up, felt like placing a stone in the middle of a flowing stream. It disrupted the current. It made the conversation eddy and stall. It was easier, smoother, to let the water flow. Without fully noticing the transition, I began to phrase things differently. Instead of asking when I should arrive, I asked whether there was anything they needed help with. The difference was subtle. The first assumed I had a place to be, the second offered labor if required. Instead of offering ideas for the rehearsal dinner, I said I was around if it would be useful to run errands. These were small changes, nearly invisible to anyone listening from the outside, but they made the conversation smoother. He sounded relieved when I kept things simple. He sounded grateful when the call ended on time, without emotional residue to clean up. That relief mattered to me more than the details I was missing. I told myself that being low maintenance was a gift I could give him. The wedding became something I heard about in summaries. They had chosen colors. They had booked a photographer. They had decided against a band. Each piece of information arrived complete, sealed up, as if there were nothing more to add. I received it that way. I thanked him for telling me. I didn't ask what came next. At some point, standing in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, watching the numbers on the microwave count down while he talked about a vendor contract, I realized I had stopped picturing the day altogether. Not because I didn't care, but because imagining required assumptions I no longer felt comfortable making. To imagine the day, I would have to place myself in the picture. I would have to guess where I was sitting, who I was talking to, what my role would be. And every time I tried to place myself in the frame, I felt a slight resistance, a fear that I was putting myself somewhere I hadn't been asked to stand. It was easier to stay with what was certain. The next call, the next update, the polite pause at the end of a sentence. So when he finally said, in that flat, decided voice, that they were keeping it small, it didn't land as a shock. It didn't feel like a sudden door slamming shut. It fit. It felt like the natural result of many small adjustments, each one reasonable on its own. The logic held. Small was easier. Small was cheaper. Small was less stressful. I could not argue with the logic because I had been participating in it for months by staying quiet. By making myself small to fit into the edges of the commute. I said I understood. He thanked me. The call ended on time. Afterward, I didn't feel the need to explain anything to myself. I didn't cry. I didn't call a friend to dissect the conversation. I left the planner where it was, closed on the shelf. I went back to the routines that didn't require decisions. I finished the dishes. I folded the laundry. It was simpler to let the arrangement stand as it was, to allow the wedding to exist nearby rather than at the center. Managing, I would later understand, had never really been the point. I wasn't managing the situation. I was being managed out of it. Gently, reasonably, and with great efficiency, and I had helped. Nothing felt wrong at first. If someone had asked me then, I would have said everything was fine. Busy, perhaps, different than before, certainly, but fine. The shift did not announce itself with a slam of a door or a raised voice. It arrived through the slow, steady removal of friction, like a machine that had been oiled so well it no longer made a sound when it moved. The first distinct marker was the holiday season. In previous years, the weeks leading up to it had been a series of negotiations, collaborative. Sometimes chaotic, but shared. We would coordinate menus. We would discuss who was arriving when. There was a density to the contact, a sense of weaving plans together. This year, the season passed quietly. There was no planning call. There was no debate over side dishes. Just a message, received a few days before the date itself. Busy here, love you, we'll see you Tuesday. I read it once, then again, I didn't reply right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because there didn't seem to be a space in the message that required filling. It was a statement of fact. I told myself it made sense. They had a lot going on. New routines, new demands. The wedding planning was consuming their bandwidth. That year, I still baked the cookies I always baked. I measured the ingredients from memory, my hands moving without hesitation, finding the rhythm they had known for decades. The flour, the sugar, the specific way the dough felt when it was ready. It was a reflex of the season. When they were done, I placed them in a tin and set it on the counter. The metal cool against my palm. It stayed there longer than usual. By the end of the day, no one had asked about it. By the time they arrived on Tuesday, the tin had been moved to a shelf. Not hidden, but no longer central. When I offered them, the response was polite. A quick, thanks. A single cookie taken. The lid replaced. No one asked for the recipe. No one asked if I had made a second batch. The tradition had not been rejected, it had simply ceased to be relevant. I moved the tin back to the shelf later that night without opening it again. Small things like that began to happen with increasing frequency. Nothing noticeable on its own. A call that ended sooner than I expected. A question that didn't come. A detail mentioned only after it was settled. I noticed how often conversations wrapped themselves up before I found a place to step in. Not abruptly, just efficiently. It was professional, almost, the way a colleague ends a meeting when the agenda is complete. Sometimes, later in the day, I would think of something to ask, a timing detail, a practical suggestion about traffic. Then I would pause, phone in hand, and decide it could wait. Often, it waited indefinitely. I found myself rereading messages. Not for meaning, but for tone. They were kind, warm enough, nothing cold, and yet, something felt slightly misaligned, like a picture frame that had been shifted just far enough to notice but not enough to justify correcting. Then one afternoon, the misalignment revealed its structure. We were on the phone, talking about something small, timing for a fitting, or perhaps a question about hotel blocks. The conversation was moving at its usual clipped pace. He was driving, I could hear the rhythmic thump of tires on pavement. He mentioned a detail about the transportation for the guests. He said it smoothly, as if it were a fact I should already know. We already decided to go with the shuttles from the north lot. He said. I paused. I was standing in my hallway, holding a laundry basket against my hip. Decided when? I asked. I thought we were still looking at the quotes. There was a short silence on the line. Not awkward, just unprepared, a beat of recalibration. Oh, he said lightly, his voice unconcerned. We talked about it in the group chat. The group chat. I hadn't known there was one. For a second, the laundry basket felt heavier. The hallway seemed to contract. It wasn't the logistical detail that mattered, I didn't care about the shuttles. It was the existence of a room I hadn't been invited to enter. A digital space where the real conversations were happening, where the debates occurred, where the we was defined. I realized then that our phone calls were not planning sessions. They were press releases. I didn't ask who was in the chat. I didn't ask why I wasn't. To ask would have been to admit that I had assumed I should be. It would have revealed the gap between my perception of my role and the reality of it. Okay, I said, that makes sense. Yeah, it's just easier to keep it all in one place. He added, unaware that he was confirming my displacement. Of course, I said. The conversation moved on. He talked about the driver's tip. I listened, but the dynamic had crystallized. I was not a participant, I was an audience member receiving a curated update. After that, information came differently. I heard the echo of the group chat in every summary. We booked it. We changed the plan. We already agreed. Already, that word appeared more often than my name. It became the defining characteristic of our interactions. I was arriving at every decision after the dust had settled. I adjusted myself to fit this new knowledge. I stopped offering suggestions. Why suggest a color scheme when it had likely been debated and decided 3 weeks ago in a thread I couldn't see? Why offer to drive when the transport logic had already been mapped out? My replies grew shorter. When I received a photo of a floral arrangement with the caption, "This is what we picked," I didn't ask about the cost or the durability of the blooms. I sent a thumbs up emoji. Sometimes, I would type out a longer response, a few sentences, thoughtfully written, expressing genuine enthusiasm or a fond memory. I would look at the text on the screen, hovering over the send button. Then I would delete it. It felt excessive. It felt like shouting in a library. The reply from their end would be a single reaction. A heart. A thumbs up. No follow-up. No opening for more. Just confirmation that my message had been received and filed. I wasn't being ignored. I was being processed. I was being finished with before the conversation began. I looked at the phone on the table. It sat there, silent and black. It was no longer a connection to the center of things. It was a receiver for notifications. The group chat was where the life was living, pulsing with updates and jokes and changes. My line was where the official record was delivered. I didn't feel angry. I felt a quiet, heavy settling in my chest. It was the feeling of realizing you are wearing a coat that is too warm for the weather, but having nowhere to put it. I left the phone where it was. I walked into the kitchen. I saw the tin of cookies on the shelf. Still full. I didn't move it. I just turned off the light and walked away. The structure was clear now. I was optional, and the most painful part was how efficiently the system worked without me. The pattern revealed itself through use rather than absence. It was not that I had stopped being contacted entirely. That would have been a clearer, if sharper, break. Instead, the moments of contact became precise, limited strictly to what was needed, and ended the instant that need was met. There was no excess in them, no spillover into conversation, no drifting into updates about the dog or the weather, no reflection on how the weeks were passing. Each interaction had a defined function, like a tool taken off a hook and then replaced. When something required my input, the message arrived directly. Usually, it was a question that only I could answer, a piece of institutional memory that had not yet been transferred to the new administration. A detail from years earlier that needed confirmation. A document from a file cabinet I still kept. The correct spelling of a distant relative's surname for the invitations. In those moments, there was no delay. There was no forwarding to the group chat I couldn't see. I was addressed plainly, as if the distance that had grown around everything else could be folded away instantly when it became inconvenient for them. I responded promptly. The requests were clear and bounded. They did not invite commentary or expansion. I gave what was asked for, the name, the date, the location of the paper, and nothing more. I typed the answer. I hit send. Once the information was transferred, the exchange ended. There was no follow-up unless another piece was required. There was no, thanks. How are things with you? There was just the thumbs up. Or a brief, got it. Afterward, the contact receded. The tide went out. Days passed without messages. Decisions continued to be made and shared through other channels. And I returned to the silence. The rhythm repeated often enough that it became familiar. Contact, then silence, use, then removal. There was no sense of calculation in this. I did not believe my son sat down and decided to limit our interactions to transactional exchanges. There was no indication that anything was being withheld intentionally to hurt me. It was far more impersonal than that. The pattern functioned automatically, like a system responding to specific inputs. When a particular function was needed, archival knowledge, logistical backup, emergency contact, the corresponding connection was activated. When it was no longer needed, the system moved on without adjustment. It was efficient. It was optimized. I noticed how naturally I stepped into these moments. The requests justified themselves. There was no question of whether I should respond or how much to give. The interaction existed for a single purpose, and fulfilling it completed the task. Seeing this did not provoke comparison or judgment. It felt factual. The clarity came from observation rather than evaluation. I was not being singled out or avoided. I was being contacted in alignment with what the process required. The wedding planning made this dynamic more visible because the needs were specific and time-bound. Each request had a clear endpoint. Once reached, the connection dissolved until the next requirement emerged. There was no overlap between usefulness and presence. At one point, he called to ask about a family contact who might help resolve a logistical issue with the rehearsal dinner venue. He needed a phone number for a cousin who worked in catering. "Do you have Mike's number?" he asked, skipping the hello, "the one for the business. Not his cell." I provided the information. I recited the number from my address book. He typed it as I spoke. "Okay, got it, thanks. Is everything all right with the venue?" I asked, a reflex of the old way of talking. "Yeah, just sorting out a permit thing," he said, already distracted. "I gotta run. Mom, thanks for the number." The line went dead. Later, I learned through a third party that the issue had been resolved through another route entirely. They hadn't used the number. The outcome did not involve me further. The system had absorbed the input, processed it, found a better pathway, and continued operating. That knowledge did not register as replacement or dismissal. It registered as completion. The task had been fulfilled, and the connection closed accordingly. Nothing about that sequence asked for interpretation. I became aware of how familiar this arrangement was. How often I had occupied similar roles before without naming them. Being contacted when something specific was needed. Remaining peripheral when it was not. The habit had been reinforced by how smoothly it kept things moving. There was no sense of value attached to these moments of usefulness. They did not elevate my position or diminish it. They defined it. The role existed within clear boundaries, activated and deactivated as required. I noticed how this clarity simplified things. There was no longer ambiguity about why I was being contacted or what was expected. Each interaction explained itself by its content. Once complete, it did not linger. The requests never extended into conversation. There were no questions about how I was doing or what I thought about the larger picture. The focus remained on the task at hand. That narrowness was consistent. I found that I did not anticipate these contacts. They arrived when needed and not otherwise. I did not prepare for them or hold space in advance. When they came, I responded. When they did not, the absence did not require explanation. The distinction between being included and being used became visible through repetition. Inclusion implies continuity, a presence that exists beyond immediate function. Inclusion means you are part of the fabric, whether or not you are currently useful. Use does not. Use arrives with a purpose and leaves when that purpose is fulfilled. Use is episodic. It has a start time and an end time. The pattern aligned with the latter. This realization did not alter my behavior. I did not withdraw cooperation or assert a different role. I continued to respond when contacted and to remain quiet when I was not. The clarity did not demand action. It removed uncertainty. Each instance reinforced the same structure. My involvement was situational. It depended on function rather than relationship or proximity. Recognizing this made it easier to stop searching for meaning beyond what was present. There was a steadiness in this understanding. It did not frame itself as loss or gain. It did not invite comparison to other roles. It described how things were operating, without assigning importance. I noticed how little emotional content accompanied these exchanges. They were neutral, efficient, complete. They did not leave residue. Once finished, they did not occupy my attention. When the next request arrived, a question about a check that needed to be written, I answered it. When nothing followed, I accepted that as part of the same cycle. The absence did not require interpretation. It confirmed the pattern rather than disrupting it. The planning continued to advance. Details accumulated. Outcomes were finalized and shared. My role appeared intermittently, then disappeared again. The repetition made the structure unmistakable. I observed how easily the system adjusted without me. When my input was not required, other routes were found. Nothing stalled. Nothing waited. The process did not depend on my continued availability. This did not provoke withdrawal or assertion. It clarified expectations. I understood when I would be contacted and why. Outside of those moments, there was no implied role to maintain. The clarity extended into how I arranged my days. I did not leave time open in anticipation of being needed. I responded when requests arrived and otherwise continued with what was already in front of me. The separation between involvement and absence became clean. I noticed how often usefulness had been mistaken for inclusion. The two had overlapped before, enough to blur their boundaries. In the past, being useful had been the ticket to the table. If I was helpful, I was present. If I was solving the problem, I was part of the group. Here, the distinction was clear. Use did not imply presence. Presence was not required for use. I could be utilized without being included. This understanding did not ask to be explained. It did not need reinforcement. It settled into place through repetition, each interaction confirming the same structure. By the time the planning reached its later stages, the pattern no longer required observation. It had established itself fully. My role was defined by function alone, activated when necessary and dormant otherwise. Seeing this clearly did not prompt reaction. Reaction would have implied dissatisfaction or defense. Neither applied. The structure operated as designed, and I adjusted my expectations to match it. The cycle continued. Requests arrived. I fulfilled them. Silence followed. The system held. There was no need to mark this understanding as a realization. It did not arrive suddenly or demand acknowledgement. It emerged gradually, through the accumulation of ordinary interactions that behaved in the same way. I moved within this structure without resistance. When I was useful, I was contacted. When I was not, I was not. The clarity allowed me to stop interpreting absence as a signal and contact as a connection. Optional sounds harmless. It sounds like a choice. But in a family, optional is a category of existence. Optional means you are informed, not consulted. Optional means your absence doesn't interrupt the plan. I hadn't been pushed away. I hadn't been rejected. I had simply stopped being necessary. And the system, in its quiet, efficient way, had adjusted to that reality long before I had. The pattern stood on its own. It did not require commentary. It explained the past and aligned with the present. That was sufficient. The space appeared without announcement. It did not replace anything that had been removed, nor did it present itself as an alternative to the noise that had preceded it. It existed simply because nothing was asking to occupy it. The absence of instruction made it noticeable. I encountered it first at home. In the hours that used to be loosely organized around anticipation. Evenings that had once remained partially open, structured to accommodate a sudden call or a change in plans, now closed on their own. I cooked dinner without checking the phone between steps. I chopped vegetables, the knife hitting the board in a steady rhythm, without pausing to glance at the screen. I sat down to read without leaving the volume of the music low in case a notification came through. The room did not feel fuller for this change. It felt unassigned. The phone stayed on the table where I left it. I did not carry it with me from room to room, a habit I hadn't realized I'd formed until it stopped. If I went upstairs to fold laundry, the phone remained downstairs. Notifications arrived or did not. Either way, they no longer rearranged the pace of the evening. The space between actions widened slightly, not because anything had been added, but because nothing was interrupting the sequence. I noticed this neutrality most clearly in the mornings. There had once been a brief interval after waking when I paused, scanning mentally for anything that might need immediate attention, a text sent late the night before, a logistical crisis that had developed while I slept. That pause shortened, then disappeared. I moved from waking to dressing to eating without checking for updates. The day began without a preface. There was no sense of relief attached to this. Relief would have implied a release from pressure, a letting go of a burden. The pressure had already thinned enough not to register. What remained was an evenness that did not need to be managed. At work, the hours retained their usual structure. Meetings happened, tasks were completed, decisions were made and documented. The difference lay not in the work itself, but in how little of it extended beyond its defined boundaries. When something ended, it ended. There was no residual attention held in reserve for family logistics. Lunch breaks stretched slightly, not in length, but in texture. I ate without reviewing messages at the same time. The absence of parallel monitoring made the break feel self-contained. When it ended, I returned to my desk without transition. The space did not ask for naming. I did not refer to it internally as peace or freedom. Attempting to describe it would have imposed structure where none was required. It existed as a condition rather than a concept. I noticed how often earlier days had been shaped by readiness, a physical and mental habit of staying partially alert, partially available. Weight shifted forward onto the balls of the feet. That posture did not fit here. There was nothing to be ready for. The space resisted that orientation without effort. Evenings settled into a consistent rhythm. Dinner at a predictable hour. Dishes washed and put away without interruption. Lights turned off in unused rooms. These actions did not carry symbolic weight. They were simply the sequence that followed from having no competing demands. The space did not fill itself with thought. There was no rush of reflection or reinterpretation of the past months. When memories surfaced, they did so briefly and passed on without anchoring. The neutrality allowed them to come and go without accumulating. I noticed how silence functioned differently here. It was no longer something I produced by withholding a response or biting my tongue. It was simply the absence of sound or signal. There was nothing active about it. It did not require maintenance. When messages did arrive, from a friend, or a spam number, they arrived into this space without disturbing it. I read them and responded if necessary. The exchange completed itself and left the space intact. The neutrality absorbed interaction without being altered by it. I became aware of how rarely I was interrupted, not because people had stopped contacting me entirely, but because the timing no longer intersected with expectation. When a call came through, it was handled and then finished. It did not leave an echo. The calendar reflected this change subtly. Blocks of time that had once been marked as tentative, held for potential dress fittings or family dinners, now appeared firm. Not because I had asserted control over them, but because nothing else was claiming them. The firmness was incidental. I noticed how little effort it took to protect this space. There was nothing to defend, no boundaries to articulate. The neutrality held because it was not contested. At home, rooms took on a different quality. They were not staged for engagement. A chair by the window became simply a place to sit, not a waiting position. The table held objects that were being used, not set aside in anticipation of someone else's needs. I realized that this space did not ask me to step into a new role. It did not invite initiative or creativity. It did not suggest that I should take up painting or start a garden to replace what had receded. It existed as a pause without direction. The absence of role was not disorienting. Roles had always been clear, even when unspoken. This was simply a period without assignment. The lack of instruction made the days simpler, not emptier. I moved through routines without self-observation. Actions did not require justification. Choices did not need to be framed as responses to anything beyond immediate circumstance. The reduction in narrative was noticeable. The space did not encourage introspection. There was no pull inward, no urge to examine motives or outcomes. It permitted attention to remain outward, focused on what was directly present. The texture of the countertop, the sound of rain against the glass, the smell of coffee. I noticed how easily time passed here. Hours did not stretch or compress. They moved at a steady pace, unshaped by anticipation or delay. Even waiting, at a stoplight, in a line at the grocery store, felt different. Waiting no longer carried implication. It was just a pause in movement. The neutrality extended to conversation. When I spoke with others, the exchanges remained contained. There was no need to bring anything back to myself afterward. Conversations ended and stayed ended. I did not fill the space with new commitments. Doing so would have implied that the space was provisional, waiting to be occupied. It did not present itself that way. It felt complete as it was. The absence of role became most visible in what I no longer did. I no longer checked messages reflexively. I no longer left gaps in my day for conversations that might arise. These habits dissolved quietly, without being replaced by new ones. I noticed how often earlier I had treated availability as a default setting. The space made clear that availability had been a posture, not a constant. Without maintaining that posture, the space remained open but not exposed. When evenings ended, they did so without review. I did not assess whether I had missed anything or failed to respond quickly enough. The question no longer arose. Sleep came without interruption. I did not wake to check the phone or replay conversations. The night passed without requiring attention. In the mornings, the space was still there. It did not reset overnight or depend on continuity. Each day entered it naturally, without transition. I realized that this space did not belong to me in a possessive sense. I did not create it. And I did not control it. It existed because the conditions that once filled it were no longer present. The neutrality did not promise permanence. It did not suggest that nothing would ever change again. It simply held for as long as it was not asked to become something else. I noticed how little language applied here. Describing the space as calm or empty would have imposed tone. It was neither. It was simply unassigned. When plans appeared on the horizon, they did not rush toward this space. They remained separate, defined by their own timelines. The space did not act as a buffer or preparation area. It coexisted without interaction. The days continued. The space remained. Nothing asked to fill it. The first message came sooner than I expected. Not long after I had returned to the quiet. Not long after the wedding had passed into the realm of completed events and the silence had settled into a reliable shape. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The time was significant only because it was the middle of the day. A time when social calls are rare and logistical ones are common. The phone buzzed against the surface of the table. The sound was brief, a single vibration that stopped as quickly as it started. I looked at the screen. The name displayed was Amanda. I did not pick it up immediately. I finished the sentence I was reading. I marked the page, then I reached for the phone. The message began politely. It was constructed carefully, with the kind of preamble that usually precedes a request for labor. She asked how I was. She mentioned that the weather had been terrible on their side of town. Then the paragraph broke, and the real purpose of the text appeared. She said they were overwhelmed. That things had gotten complicated with work schedules and the new commute. That the dog was struggling with the long days alone. Or perhaps there was a trip coming up that they hadn't mentioned before. The specifics blurred slightly as I read. Because the core of the message was not the reason, but the solution. They needed help, not for a day, for a few months. Just until things settled down. She wrote, "We were hoping you could handle the afternoons. It would make such a difference." I read it once, then again. I didn't feel startled. I felt pressure. It was not a sharp, sudden weight. It was layered, heavy and familiar, like a blanket made of lead. There was the system first, the unspoken, ancient rule that mothers step in when things get hard. The idea that availability is assumed, especially after you have proven it before. The assumption that my time was liquid, ready to be poured into whatever vessel they presented. Then there was the history. The years of showing up, of filling gaps, of being the one who adjusted so others didn't have to. That history pressed forward, quietly asking to be honored. It reminded me of all the times I had said yes before the question was even finished. It reminded me that saying yes was how I had maintained proximity. Then came the social weight. What would it look like if I said no? What story would form without my voice shaping it? The familiar expectation hovered, that I would understand, that I would make it easier, that I would be the release valve for their pressure. I set the phone down on the table. The screen went dark. I stood there in the kitchen. Nothing else demanded my attention. The refrigerator hummed. The light from the window remained steady, but the neutrality of the room had been punctured. I felt my body respond before my thoughts did. My shoulders lifted slightly, a defensive reflex. My breath became shallow. My stomach tightened. This was familiar. This was the physical sensation of the yes forming. This was what had always happened right before I agreed, the body bracing itself for the displacement of my own needs to accommodate theirs. I walked to the window and looked out. I wasn't seeing the street. I was seeing the logistics of what they were asking. The drive, the hours, the waiting, the return to a schedule that was not mine, the inevitable erosion of the space I had just begun to inhabit. I noticed how carefully the message avoided asking if I was free. It assumed I was. It assumed that the silence of the last few months was simply a pause. A holding pattern until I was called back into service. "We'll need you," that was the subtext. "It won't be forever." I turned back to the phone. The notification light blinked once. Inside the pressure, something else tightened. It wasn't anger. It was quieter than that. It was an instinct, but not the one I was used to. Usually, the instinct was to smooth things over, to say yes quickly, before the silence could become uncomfortable, to prevent them from having to ask someone else, to prove that I was still the person who fixed things. But this time, beneath the reflex to agree, there was a resistance. It felt solid. It felt like a wall that had been built slowly, brick by brick, over the last year of being informed rather than consulted. I picked up the phone again. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. There were words I could have used. Gentle ones, reasonable ones. I could have explained that I had appointments. I could have invented a conflict. I could have said, "Let me check my calendar and get back to you," buying time to dilute the refusal. I could have offered a compromise. I can do Tuesdays, but not the whole week. I can help for a week, but not a month. These were the tools of the old role. The role of the negotiator, the accommodator. But something in me didn't reach for them. Using them would have been a re-entry into the negotiation. It would have implied that my time was still up for discussion. That the default answer was yes, unless I could prove otherwise. I realized that explaining was a form of apology, and I had nothing to apologize for. I typed a short reply. I can't do that. I looked at the words. They looked stark on the white background. They lacked the softening agents of, unfortunately, or, I wish I could. I considered adding, right now. I can't right now, but right now implies that later. I might. Right now suggests a temporary condition. I deleted, right now. I considered adding, this time. I can't this time, but this time implies that next time. The answer might be different. I deleted, this time. I didn't add details. I didn't justify it. I didn't say why. The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence. I can't do that. It felt dangerous. It felt like cutting a wire without knowing if it was live. The fear was specific. If I say no, will they stop asking entirely? Will this be the end of the contact? The answer came just as clearly. The contact is already only transactional. If I remove the transaction, what is left? I had to be willing to find out. I pressed send before I could revise it into something easier to accept. The message bubble appeared on the screen. Blue, small, final. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. It wasn't the neutral silence of the last few weeks. It was charge. It was the silence of a room where a loud noise has just stopped. I waited for the response. I put the phone down and walked away from it. I went into the living room. I sat down. I stood up. I couldn't settle. The cost of the no was this agitation. This sudden spike in heart rate. It was the feeling of having broken a rule that everyone else was playing by. I told myself that they would be angry, or hurt, or confused. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. The phone buzzed again. I walked back to the kitchen. I didn't rush, but I didn't delay. I needed to know the shape of the fallout. I unlocked the screen. The reply was brief. Okay, we understand. We'll figure something else out. I read it. I read it again. There was no anger in the words. There were no exclamation points. There was no guilt trip. But there was distance. I could feel it settle between us. It was the cool, professional distance of a manager whose request has been declined and who is already moving on to the next option on the list. We'll figure something else out. And they would. Of course they would. I hadn't won anything. Nothing had shifted in my favor. They weren't suddenly going to realize my value because I had withheld it. They weren't going to rush over to persuade me. The structure was still there. The expectations hadn't disappeared, they had just been redirected. But something had been interrupted. For the first time, I had not stepped forward to fill the space automatically. I had not offered myself as the solution to a problem I did not create. That didn't feel empowering. It didn't feel like a triumph. It felt exposed. I stood in the kitchen, feeling the draft from the window. The no had stripped away the last illusion of necessity. By saying I couldn't help, I had confirmed that I was outside the circle of daily operations. I had chosen the outside. I went about the rest of my day more slowly than usual. My hands felt slightly numb. The quiet I had found earlier didn't vanish, but it wasn't untouched anymore. Someone had reached into it. They had tested whether it was still available. They had knocked on the door to see if the old occupant was still there. And I had answered, but I hadn't opened the door. I cooked dinner that night. The routine was the same, but the air felt different. I was aware of the phone in a way I hadn't been for weeks. It sat silent on the counter. No further messages came. No, are you sure? No, please, Mom. The lack of pushback was its own kind of answer. It confirmed that my help was desired, but not required. It was a preference, not a necessity. I ate alone. The house was quiet. I realized that the pressure I had felt, the heavy, layered weight of history and expectation, had been largely internal. It was real, but it was mine. They had simply asked. I had said no. They had moved on. The transaction had failed. The system had reset. I washed the dishes. I wiped the counter. I had kept my time. I had kept my space. But I had paid for it with the knowledge that they could, and would, manage perfectly well without me. The evening closed in. I sat in the chair by the window. I didn't pick up a book. I just sat. The resistance had held. The boundary had held. And nothing else happened. That was the cost. And that was the truth. The collision did not occur as an argument. It arrived as a conversation that followed familiar rules while operating on incompatible assumptions. The setting was ordinary. The timing was practical. Nothing about the setup suggested that anything fundamental was about to be tested. He called in the early afternoon, a time chosen for efficiency rather than privacy. His voice carried the same measured tone he had used in recent weeks. Steady and task-oriented, it was the voice of someone ticking through a list, where I was one of several items requiring a checkmark. He began by outlining what still needed to be coordinated for the upcoming weeks. Speaking as if the framework were already shared, he referenced dates we hadn't discussed and decisions I hadn't been part of, weaving them into a narrative that assumed my compliance was already secured. I listened without interruption. The details were familiar. Confirmations, small adjustments, logistical shifts that fit within the existing structure. The logic behind them was sound. Everything he described made sense when viewed from within the system he was operating, a system designed for optimization, speed, and the path of least resistance. When he paused, I responded by clarifying a point that affected my availability, referencing the "no" I had given earlier. The statement was factual, contained, stripped of emphasis. It did not challenge the plan itself. It addressed only how the plan intersected with my schedule. There was a brief silence on the line. Then he repeated the plan. Not in full, but enough to reassert its parameters. The repetition did not acknowledge what I had said. It repositioned the conversation back onto its original track. It was a subtle correction. The way a GPS recalculates without judgment when a driver misses a turn. I restated the constraint, this time with slightly more specificity. I did not raise my voice or alter my tone. I did not frame it as an objection. I described the limitation as a fixed condition, not as a preference. He responded by explaining why the timing was necessary. The explanation was thorough. It accounted for other people's schedules, for the caterer's requirements, for logistics already set in motion. The reasoning did not engage with the constraint I had mentioned. It existed alongside it, as if both could be true without adjustment. The conversation continued this way for several minutes. I named boundaries. He named requirements. Each statement followed logically from its own premise. Neither premise accommodated the other. I noticed how carefully he avoided addressing the specific point I was making. Not through dismissal, but through redirection. Each time I narrowed the focus to my availability, he widened it to include the larger system. The scale shifted away from me without being explicitly stated. I tried once more, choosing words that minimized interpretation. I said when I could and could not be present. I did not explain why. I did not justify. I presented the information as neutral data, the way one might report the weather. He acknowledged hearing me, right. Okay, then immediately returned to discussing how the plan would proceed. The acknowledgement functioned as a bridge rather than a stop. It allowed the conversation to move forward without altering course. It became clear then that hearing and incorporating were not the same action. My words entered the conversation, but they did not change its direction. They were received as information, not as input. The collision lay in this distinction. I was speaking to be accounted for. He was listening to remain informed. The difference was subtle enough to pass unnoticed if not repeated. But here, in the quiet of the afternoon, it was unmistakable. I adjusted my approach, asking a question instead of making a statement. The question sought clarification on whether the plan could accommodate my constraint. It was framed politely, without implication. He answered by explaining again why the plan was structured as it was. The answer addressed the plan, not the question. The structure remained intact. I felt the reduction then, not as a feeling to be named, sadness, frustration, but as a shift in how the conversation positioned me. My participation narrowed to acknowledgement. My contributions did not accumulate. They evaporated upon delivery. The conversation moved toward conclusion. He summarized next steps, speaking quickly, efficiently. The summary did not include what I had said. It reflected only what was already decided. When he asked if that all made sense, the question functioned as confirmation rather than inquiry. It invited agreement, not revision. I said yes. The call ended shortly after. I remained where I was when the call disconnected. The room had not changed. The day continued. The traffic outside maintained its rhythm. What lingered was the recognition of how the exchange had operated. The logics had collided without touching. On one side, a system designed to optimize coordination. On the other, a statement of presence that did not fit into that optimization. The collision produced no sparks because nothing was forced to give way. The system simply flowed around the obstacle. Later, a message arrived summarizing the call. It listed dates and actions. It did not mention my constraint. The summary functioned as documentation, not as dialogue. I read it carefully. Everything in it was accurate within its own frame. The omission was not a mistake. It reflected what the conversation had retained. I considered replying to restate my position. The thought passed without settling. Repeating myself would not change the structure that had already shown how it processed information. Another message followed, this one requesting confirmation of a detail that did not involve me directly. I replied promptly. The exchange completed itself without friction. The collision clarified something about how decisions moved in this new landscape. They flowed around points of resistance rather than through them. Resistance was noted, then bypassed. In subsequent conversations, the pattern repeated. I spoke. He acknowledged. The plan continued unchanged. Each exchange reinforced the same dynamic without escalating it. I noticed how my words became lighter in these conversations. Not fewer, but less weighted. I offered information without expecting it to be incorporated. The expectation had adjusted. This adjustment did not occur through choice. It occurred through exposure. Repeated encounters with the same logic taught me how to participate with minimal friction. The collision did not result in silence. I continued to speak when necessary. It resulted in being heard without effect. I observed how this affected my listening. I began to listen for confirmation rather than for openings. The conversation shifted from collaborative to procedural without being named as such. The absence of resolution was not frustrating. Frustration would have implied a blocked goal. There was no goal left to pursue. The exchange had revealed its limits. I noticed how often similar conversations had occurred in the past without registering as collisions. Familiarity had smoothed them over. The noise of daily life had obscured the mechanics. Now, with the structure more visible, the incompatibility stood out. The logics did not argue. They coexisted briefly, then separated. Each returned to its own path unchanged. After one call, I realized I could predict how the conversation would unfold before it began. The predictability reduced the impulse to prepare. There was nothing to prepare for. Messages continued to arrive. Some required response. Some did not. None altered the underlying arrangement. The collision did not lead to withdrawal or assertion. It led to calibration. I adjusted the weight I placed on being understood versus being acknowledged. Being heard less did not mean being ignored. It meant occupying a narrower channel. The channel allowed transmission but not influence. I noticed how this narrowed channel simplified decisions. I no longer considered how my words might alter outcomes. I considered only whether they conveyed necessary information. This shift did not register as loss. It registered as alignment with how things were functioning. The system continued to operate efficiently. Plans progressed. Details accumulated. My presence remained peripheral but intact. The collision did not close anything. It did not open anything either. It clarified the boundaries within which conversation occurred. I did not revisit the exchange to reinterpret it. Doing so would have implied unresolved meaning. The meaning had already been demonstrated through repetition. When another call came, I answered. When another summary arrived, I read it. The pattern held. The collision had done its work without announcement. It had shown me how much room there was to be heard and where that room ended. Nothing changed afterward. That was the point. The absence of change was the revelation. My no had been absorbed. The logistics had been rerouted. And the machinery continued to hum. I was not the engine. I was not the steering wheel. I was simply a passenger who had asked for a stop. And when the stop was missed, the car kept driving. I watched the phone on the table. It was quiet. The silence was not waiting for me to speak. It was simply the sound of a system that no longer required my voice to function. The space did not present itself as an ending. It was there in the way rooms remain after activity has passed through them. Holding their dimensions without reflecting what had occurred. Light entered through the window at a shallow angle and shifted slowly across the floor. Nothing adjusted to follow it. The room stayed consistent, uninterested in time. A chair stood near the wall, not positioned for use or avoidance. Its placement suggested neither invitation nor refusal. It existed as furniture does when it has not been arranged with purpose beyond function. The distance between it and the table was ordinary, measured without intention. I entered without checking the time. The hour did not matter here. The day had loosened its grip, and the evening had not yet defined itself. The space accepted that interval without distinction, as if it were accustomed to moments that did not belong fully to anything. I stood for a while. Standing did not feel provisional. It did not suggest waiting. When I sat, the movement was unmarked. The chair supported my weight evenly. There was no sound that announced the shift. No cue that something had begun or ended. The window was open just enough to allow air to move through. Outside sounds arrived briefly and left. A car passed. A voice rose and fell somewhere beyond the frame. None of it lingered long enough to form a pattern or invite attention. My hands rested where they fell. There was nothing placed in them. No object waited to be examined or held. The absence did not feel intentional. It felt settled, as if nothing had been removed to create it. The space was complete without addition. Time behaved differently here. It did not advance toward anything. Minutes passed without stacking themselves into urgency. I noticed their passing only when the light shifted again, thinning as it moved farther along the floor, changing shape without implying conclusion. The room did not recall anything. It did not echo earlier versions of itself or suggest that something had once occupied it differently. It existed only in the present arrangement, without reference or memory. I became aware of my breathing without attempting to change it. The rhythm remained steady and unremarkable. There was no need to deepen it or regulate it. It continued on its own, unnoticed until there was nothing else competing for attention. The door stayed partly open, not wide, not closed. It did not frame the room as interior or exterior. It allowed movement without implying departure or arrival. Anyone could have passed through it. No one did. There was no posture here that matched anticipation. The forward lean that had once accompanied readiness did not find a place to settle. My body remained upright without tension, balanced without instruction. The second chair remained unused. It had not been positioned for someone else. Its emptiness did not suggest absence. It was simply unoccupied, like many things that exist without being claimed. Thoughts passed through without attaching themselves to direction. They appeared briefly and dissolved, leaving no residue behind them. There were no sentences forming that needed delivery. No words rehearsed for future use. The stillness did not feel imposed. It did not hold anything back. It occupied the space where motion was unnecessary. It remained flexible, capable of change without requiring it. At some point, the light softened enough to notice. Shadows lengthened along the wall and then thinned again. The change marked only the movement of time. Indifferent to significance, I stood and walked to the window. Not to look for anything, but because movement was possible. The view outside was ordinary, a street, buildings, the suggestion of lives continuing beyond the frame. Nothing aligned itself with expectation. I did not lean out. I did not withdraw. The window did not ask for a choice between inside and outside. It remained what it was. A boundary without emphasis. When I returned to the chair, sitting again did not reset the moment. There was no before or after attached to the movement. It was simply another position occupied for a time. The room did not ask who I was or what I intended. It did not mirror or resist. It offered no recognition. That neutrality did not flatten the space. It widened it, leaving room for presence without demand. I noticed how little there was to resolve. Nothing here required explanation. The space did not point forward or backward. It did not invite interpretation. It allowed itself to remain. A phrase passed through my mind briefly. Unanchored. If you're listening, it did not attach itself to a person or expectation. It did not wait for a response. It moved on without altering the room. I sat until sitting no longer registered as an action. When I finally rose, it was not to end anything. It was simply the next movement available. The room did not record the departure. It did not shift to mark it. The door remained open enough. Light from outside continued to change. The space held its shape. I didn't lose my son. I lost the version of me who begged.